Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 926 for February 16th, 2022, with our happy hour live webcast from the other night with Maker's Mark Chairman Emeritus Bill Samuels Jr. You can catch our live webcasts every Friday night at 5 p.m. New York time on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel, our Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. Thanks as always to our presenting sponsors of WhiskyCast, Redbreast and Dewar's, for making our live webcasts possible each week, along with the segment sponsors on our flagship WhiskyCast podcast, Writer's Tears, Sagamore Spirit, Catoctin Creek, the Dalmore, Mortlock, and Scarabus. Let's bring in our guest right now, the one, the only, Bill Samuels Jr. from Maker's Mark. Bill, how are you tonight?
Well, I'm good. It's Good Friday evening. It's just starting to rain in Louisville, so this is the perfect spot to be.
And you're in the office at 5 o'clock on Friday night, which is rare for you, right?
No, it's not. It's really not. Even though I've been retired 11 years, I was always much better at working than I was socializing. So this is my home away from home.
So it seems like you're almost busier now than you were before you retired.
Well, I'm busier. It takes me longer to do anything, and I don't have to do any, and I'm not invited to do anything serious, but I do get to enjoy the good work of my son and his team. And I must say, regretfully, that they're doing a much better job than I did.
Well, they had you to learn from.
They don't say that.
They're not going to say that. They don't want your head to get too big.
I think that's right. Well, don't believe that'll happen. No, it's been a great experience for me. And I think the one thing I really regret is I can't call up my father and Colonel Beam and Mr. Van Winkle and the Motlows from down Tennessee and invite them all to lunch and share with them what's going on in Bourbon Land. They would love it. I mean, most of them spent their careers being abused by the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League and local governments, and all of that's disappeared.
I don't think anybody misses those days at all, though.
Well, there's not too many of us alive. Jimmy Russell and I are about the only two alive that remember, even a piece of it. So we're tickled to death.
So as Steve Beal points out, Steve says, great to see you, and he says you look great. What are you doing to keep active and keep energetic now at age 82?
Well, I go to the gym 4 days a week and work a lot of crossword puzzles and harass my grandchildren and spend as much time with Rob as he'll let me, at least getting informed on the business and giving him my point of view. And I've been very good about not insisting that my point of view is the correct one. He does exactly what he thinks is right. And after all, I've been retired 11 years. But I'm proud as I can be that my father's hobby, retirement hobby, is what it is today. But I'm equally proud of what's happened to bourbon and what it's meant to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And that's been possible only because so many wonderful people have entered this industry, energetic people at a young age, and have given it the same kind of commitment that we gave Maker's Mark back in the early days. It's just wonderful to go around and visit the craft distillers and see the revitalization of our heritage distilleries.
You just mentioned something that I have not heard before. I did not know that this was your dad's retirement hobby. I thought this was just one stage in his life. I didn't realize it was a retirement hobby for him.
That's what he called it because it was such a stupid idea at the time. Bourbon was in free fall. The banks wouldn't lend him any money. So there's no way that he could have made a commercial venture out of it. And I think to some degree, that's what caused things to develop so slowly. And you got to remember back in 1953, the the best you could say about really good bourbon was it was kind of like really good Brussels sprouts. Not very many people were interested. And if it's a hobby, it doesn't have to rationalize anything. And if it fails, hobbies fail, no big deal. And he made a pretty significant investment, not in the facility. That was only $35,000, but your working capital, even if you only make 1,000 barrels a year and the bank doesn't give you any money, you're operating out of your back pocket. And I know when I graduated from high school, which was the 5th year of it, I thought we were going in the poorhouse, and so did my mother. And that's really what energized her to get on the ball and design the package for him. Came up with the name and, of course, the red wax. All that was hers. And it was out of sheer panic that he didn't have enough sense to do it himself.
I'm familiar with that sentiment, that feeling. I've had that happen in my life, too, a couple of times. But your mom is also in the Bourbon Hall of Fame, along with your dad and along with you. But a lot of folks don't really realize that Margie Samuels really should be the first lady of bourbon for what she did, keeping your dad in line.
Well, and we never recognized that because she was so domineering, and we were so glad when she left the room or left the meeting because life just got more comfortable. And the fact she never really worked for the company. She would only sporadically have ideas. And fortunately for us, the great majority of those ideas ended up being very good, like the Bourbon Trail. Bourbon tourism started with her need to make sure my sister had a job. And Leslie really was only qualified to talk. And so she was the first tour guide in the bourbon industry back in 1969. And of course, we all like each other. So Leslie ran around after she got a few visitors. And before you know it, she had Barton and Heaven Hill and Willett on board. And our purpose was really community development for Bardstown, to put butts in beds in Bardstown. And that was the humble beginning of the Bourbon Trail, long before it was ever called the Bourbon Trail.
And it has really skyrocketed to the point now where 1.5 million visitors last year.
Yeah, and if we get through COVID, I think the restriction is going to be our collective ability to deal with all the people and to deal with them like we like to deal with them, which is as if each one is the most important person that's ever visited the distillery. And we've all got that same mindset. So there's a little concern about if it gets too big too fast before we're really able to deal with each visitor personally. And I know that's the goal of all of us. And we've been able to manage it so far. But there is a limit.
We have a comment from Bill Ricker up in Boston. If bourbon were really like Brussels sprouts, I might like more of them.
Think of it as a figure of speech. That was actually the comment that our banker made in apologizing for not being able to make my father a loan in the beginning.
And I'm thinking,
bourbon, there's really not much interest, Bill. Maybe you ought to try something else.
I'm thinking some of those bankers were kicking themselves about 15, 20 years later for not being in there at the start.
Yeah, they should have been asking for stock.
We have a comment from Chris Tadsenko down in Australia. He still has his empty first bottle of Makers for in Australia with the label saying imported by Suntory. And the last time he saw you, you asked for that bottle as you do not have that label.
I don't.
What do you not have of Makers that you're still trying to track down besides that one?
Well, actually, a lot of the things that we're trying to track down, nobody ever threw anything away since 1953. So we've got it all. We've got even Mom, the wax pot that Mom dipped the first bottle in. That's on display at the old family home that Rob bought back within the last year. But a lot of the stuff we don't have has to do with the family before 1943, when my father sold the old T.W. Samuels company. And from time to time, we get people bringing stuff to the house, and very slowly we're reconnecting our history with the 18th and 19th century.
What was your thought when somebody decided they were going to try to resurrect the old T.W. Samuels Distillery in Gatesville?
I think it's great. It's really right next to Samuels, Kentucky, which is right next to where the old family homestead is that we've restored. So, yeah, we welcome it. It's a very interesting place as it is, because the last time it was actually used other than bottling was 1943. So it looks like a ghost town of old machinery. And especially if you're an engineer, you'll love it. It's not actually a tour, but you can get access to it. Somebody's over there all the time. And there's not much activity. I keep hearing that it's going to be restored. They're going to do this and going to do that, but I haven't seen the outcomes yet. Yeah,
and the same here. You mentioned engineering, and let's talk about your background in rocket science and engineering. And before you got moved into the whiskey business, one of the things we talked about before we started the show was a number of the craft distillers and the folks that are entering this as second careers, sort of like your dad did, had come out of the tech industry, come out of engineering backgrounds, come out of science backgrounds. What does that give somebody who's coming into distilling?
Well, the main thing for me is that the majority of the craft distillers have a technical background. It tells me that they're focused on the product and the integrity of the product and crafting something interesting and possibly different. Or if it were more slanted towards salesmanship, the focus might be on a marketing plan or strategy. And being an engineer myself, and Dad was a mechanical engineer and Mom was a chemist, everything he did in those early days was really focused on the organoleptics of what he was up to. When I started, he didn't have a budget. So it was, let's do a little bit better every year. That was kind of the goal, but let's don't screw the whiskey up in the process. And I'm seeing a lot of that now, and I like it.
You told me before that one of the things you've been doing is going around and visiting a bunch of the craft distilleries around Kentucky. What are you seeing that impresses you about these folks?
Well, they're all sharp as they can be, for one thing. We never had young people like that wanting to get into the industry in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the 80s, and into the 90s. So that's a good sign. I think, and they're all solid. And I've always felt like, well, eventually we're going to have a downturn. And isn't it nice that we're going to have really sharp people going into that downturn? Gives us collectively a much better chance to survive it and move on to the next level. Before bourbon, back in the 19th century and really well through Prohibition, it was a commodity. Everybody did the same thing. It was either boom times or down times, much like being in the coal business. And it's very different from that now.
Do you see a downturn coming?
I don't see it coming, but I mean, I think when you're investing 6 to 8 years out in what you're doing, you better have one eye turned toward a sour scenario, because every distillery that's ever gone out of business has gone out of business with warehouses full of whiskey. They run out of working capital. So you got to have your nose poking in that direction somewhat.
What did you do and your dad before you to make sure that didn't happen with Maker's Mark?
Well, he set the stage by identifying what I would call really the beginning of the craft phenomena. It just took him about 50 years to get anybody's attention that it was going to work. He started out, it was his retirement hobby. It was mom decided he needed to do something because he was getting in the way, hanging, just being around, telling her how to run the farm. She didn't go much for that. So he had to do something. He didn't want a job. He didn't like the family whiskey, what they'd been making for 5 generations before. And distilleries were becoming available for almost nothing. And so it was a laboratory for him. And then when he figured out what he wanted to do, he went real slow. He was forced into going slower than he wanted to go because he couldn't get any funding outside of his own wallet. And so by the time, I think the main thing we did, we never turned forecasting over to salesmen. We always managed and tried to control forecasting, and as a result, we've never had any excess bourbon, and that goes all the way to 1959 when the first bottling.
And you've never sourced and you've never sold, right?
We've never sourced and we've never. I don't know that there's another distillery that's ever. I don't think Jack Daniel's has done that, but in Kentucky, I don't know that there's any other. It's just hard when a brand grows. And the temptation, my God, you got all this business coming at you. What are you going to do? Well, we learned to say no early on, and it's become part of what we do now. Manage growth to about 9% a year. And that's, by the way, that's what it's averaged since time. We've never had a big boom year, and we've never had a down year since 1959.
And you've been able to manage that double-digit growth or that growth around 9%, despite coming out with things like Maker's 46 and Maker's Cask Strength that could theoretically have cut into the sales of the flagship makers.
Well, at least, yeah, but it's a limited market, both of it. It's 46 has now got its own identity, and it's doing really well. But we had it's been out about 13 years now. So we had a pretty good lead time there.
That was your retirement project.
That's right. It's the only thing I did in 50 years.
Besides not screw up the whiskey like your dad told you not to, right?
Oh, he had me scared to death. No, when I showed up in 1967 out of law school, he gave me my job description, and it said, go find customers. Translated, it meant, please don't come to the distillery and mess anything up. So he kept in control of that, and my job was to go find customers, and I didn't know much about that, being an engineer and a lawyer. But eventually we figured it out.
Do you miss the engineering side?
Well, I don't really miss it because we're basically in the engineering business at the distillery. We're constantly built. Remember, my engineering is structures, and we're all the time building something down there, and I love it. I am in the way. I'm like a kid.
Reminds me of the story you tell about playing Lincoln Logs with Colonel Beam as a boy.
Well, and that might have been where the interest started. He was a great mentor, even though he died right before my 8th birthday. God, I spent so much time with him, and he always talked while I was sitting on the floor, building things his way with his Lincoln Logs. He's always telling me I ought to get into business. I told him I wanted to be an architect, and he said, don't do it. He said, every time anybody in your family's ever tried to do something other than make and sell whiskey, they screwed it up. And so eventually, after I wasn't a horribly successful rocket scientist, and probably would have been a mediocre lawyer, came back to the company, made the commitment for 1 year. And it was so darn much fun working with my father, and he agreed maybe we ought to try and make this a viable commercial enterprise, that I said, Lord, this is, I'm not going to have an opportunity like this to be able to work with him and do something that I'm really passionate about. And so we joined hips and off we went.
I am sipping from my Ambassador bottle.
Aha, that means you've been to the distillery again.
Many times over the years, but I've been sitting on this since 2013.
Yes.
And I've still got, and I hadn't opened it until today, but I wanted to open it. And we have a question or comment from Chris Ratcliffe. The Makers Ambassadors is such a wonderful, engaging program. Whose idea was it, and how many ambassadors actually come to see their barrel and get their bottles, like I did years ago?
Well, it really was my idea, but I didn't have the technical skills to know how to make it work. So we had to hire a consulting company to put the idea together. What we really wanted to do is to have a connection with friends of the brand. For the first 30 years of Maker's Mark, all our customers were in Kentucky, and to be honest, we probably knew 70% of them. And so when that Wall Street Journal article hit 1980, that was the instant explosion into the influence centers of every important bar and restaurant in a major U.S. city had to have a bottle of Maker's Mark. But it was also the end of our ability to communicate directly, both ways, dialogue, with customers. So I said, what if we could have a program like the airlines have, but without trying to sell anybody anything, just a way to connect. And in the beginning, we just, it started 10 or 15,000 ambassadors. I think now it's around the world, maybe 400,000 or so. And you would be amazed the number of them make the pilgrimage to Kentucky. I would say it's in the 25 to 30,000 a year. Just come down to get their ambassador bottles when it's time.
And they wait that 6 years from when they get their birth certificate till they get the actual bottle.
We try to stay in touch with everybody during the 6 year interval. And a lot of people, if they're within a reasonable distance or if they've got family or anybody in the area, they'll sneak by on a vacation trip. Love it. And honestly, before COVID, that's what I enjoyed most about retirement. I could go to the distillery and visit with the Makers Ambassador, spend all day down there, seem like I'm there 15, 20 minutes. And I'd do that 3 days a week. And when I'd sneak a half hour, I'd go harass the engineers working on one of the buildings or one of the process facilities that we had. So I'd get a little engineering in and a lot of visits with customers.
And as Chris Ratcliffe points out, being an ambassador definitely led to him going to the distillery on his honeymoon.
That's what I'm talking about. We've had a number of, we don't do weddings, but we've had a tremendous number of engagements at the distillery. Most of them tend to be under the Chihuly that piece Dale Chihuly did in the old 1870s warehouse. That's kind of where everybody wants to get engaged.
Have you ever had any, if you can't do weddings, has anybody ever, I'm trying to think of the most delicate way to say this, had their ashes spread at the distillery?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there have been.
You don't encourage that, I would assume.
Well, I don't think we've had anything to do with it. I think it's happened, and then we find out about it later. Yeah, I know we had one a few years ago, and I was down there when it supposedly happened, but I didn't find out about it until a couple of weeks later. But I did notice there was some unusually tall green grass in this one area next to the creek, and I think that might have been it.
What does it say about the work that you and your family have done over the years when somebody has that level of passion that they want their ashes spread at your distillery?
Oh, I mean, that's what makes it so much fun, being there and talking to the visitors that come through, particularly the ambassadors, because they know so much and they care so much. And it's just, I mean, it just makes an old man feel pretty good. I really wish Mom and Dad could sit there with me and listen to all the comments that the folks make when they come down to get their bottles, or they come down just to visit.
Comment from Christopher Malloy. It must be an amazing feeling to have your product on the shelves of nearly every bar and restaurant in the world. Congratulations. Let me ask you, where's the most unusual place you've seen a bottle of Maker's Mark?
Oh, well...
In traveling around the world at various bars and places and all over the world.
You got to remember, before 1980, before that Wall Street Journal article, there was no place out of Kentucky I could go where I could find it. And then after that, it took a while when you got out of the big cities. And I think maybe one of the places when I was out in Montana one time, and it was a little town called Moose, and the advertising guy was out there with me, and he knew they didn't have it, and he said he'd like a Maker's Mark, and they came back with a can of baking soda. They thought that he had ordered baking soda, and they had a little can of that. So that kind of put us in our place. But I mean, in the beginning, remember now, 11 years ago, my job was to hopefully create Maker's Mark into an American iconic product. My son's job is to maintain that, enhance it if possible, and internationalize Makers. So since I retired, I have not done a lot of traveling outside, so I haven't really seen the job that's been done in Europe and Asia in the last 11 years, but I know it's significant, and I'm awful proud of him for doing it and doing it well.
Great comment here from John Kalinowski. Thanks for making Maker's Mark with a low center of gravity. I bought one immediately after the Fukushima earthquake in Tokyo. Other bourbons were all broken on the floor. You got him through the aftermath.
Well, that's Mom. She designed the bottle. I don't know that she had that in mind.
Yeah, because this doesn't tip.
Yeah, no, it doesn't tip as much, does it? Well, I'm glad. I'll have to send her a note on that one.
Brian Cox, a former colleague of yours, your old brand manager in France at one point. That's where he got his start in the whiskey industry. He wants to know what you loved most about working in the industry, and what did you enjoy the least?
Oh, the least was the air travel, by far. And the most, two things. The most, number one was the people, and number two was the creative process that we went through that resulted in Maker's 46. I mean, that took me right back to my engineering roots, and I loved it. Project management. And that was the last thing I did. So I had been a long time since I was a project engineer on something.
I remember tasting Maker's 46 with Kevin Smith back when he was master distiller in the Food Network studios in New York City. He was there doing some stuff, and I went in to meet him there, and he brought a sample of Maker's 46, and I'm thinking, we did something new. He said, we did something new. And I'm going, you what? You did something new after this many years? He goes, yeah, we did something new with staves. And I'm going, okay, let's try it. And I'm thinking, wow, this is good.
Yeah.
And it went from there on to the private label selections, that the private select barrels that really just sort of expanded to that, didn't they?
It was interesting because Rob and Jane Bowie came into the office after I'd retired, and they were getting beat up because we didn't have a barrel select program. And Rob said, we can't have a barrel select program because all of our barrels are supposed to be the same. Our objective is continuity. And since we rotate the barrels, which there isn't much of that done in the industry, and we rotate them all, the objective really is consistency. So it would be a bit of a scam to tell people they could go in this warehouse and find something different than in another warehouse. And so we started talking, and Rob said, what was the most fun you had in your 50 years? And I said, other than the people, it was Maker's 46. And I said, it was so much fun. What would happen if we would reverse that and take me out of the picture and allow our customers to create their own version of Maker's Mark, which is exactly what I did. I had boundary conditions. I couldn't have run off the reservation with this thing. We put some pretty tight boundaries on it. The one reason we wanted to continue to be able to call it Kentucky Straight Bourbon, so it couldn't be influenced by any other spirit and anything other than oak. And so that's what the Independent Stave Company helped us create. And now you come to the distillery and you have 1,010 ways to create your own version of Maker's Mark. You better have a good night's sleep the night before and get ready for about 3 or 4 hours of pretty intense work. And they have created some unbelievable products.
Question from Chris Ratcliffe. Were you ever tempted or advised to screw with the whiskey by doing things like higher price points or vintage expressions or limited releases other than, say, the Keeneland bottles and special releases and things like that, or special whiskeys?
Well, first off, all our whiskey special. It's all the same thing. We have one mash bill, and everything that's done has to be legitimate. It has to not be a gimmick, and it has to have some organoleptic distinction that we think is worthy of putting in the bottle. And 46 was the first time that we got to that point, and that took 50 years. And now, using that wonderful process, we have options. Plus the fact I did something really stupid. In the early days, my father would bottle one barrel unfiltered and would cut it down to 101 proof, which was the lowest proof that he could bottle without having to filter any of the fatty acids out. And that was for him and his friends. So I come into the business in 67, and I'm noticing that about half the phone calls I get and almost all the harassment is people want to be on his gift list. It wasn't in the market. He had one barrel, which meant he had about 25 cases. He had maybe 300 bottles for the year, and he would give out about 285 of them. And we'd have about 3,000 or 4,000 people a year wanting to be on that gift list. And I made the incredibly brilliant decision that he needed to stop doing that because it was wasting my time. That's a true story. And so he said, all right, I'll discontinue it if it'll make your life easier. And so we did. And then Rob happens to find a bottle about 4 years ago and says, what is this? And I said, and I told him. He opened it up. He said, this stuff's really good. Why did you kill it? And I told him, I said, well, it never was on the market, but it was. It was on the market in Japan for a while. And that's when we killed it. But it's now back on the market since I'm retired. And he didn't even ask me if it was a good idea this time.
Speaking of good ideas and bad ideas and I got to bring this one up. Who was really responsible for the 42% version a few years ago?
Well,
I will be honest with you. I'm looking at a bottle of it. I have a bottle on my shelf behind the camera.
Well, what we found out in that was that our customers would forgive us once, but we have learned not to do it again, not even to think about doing it again. In all fairness, Rob was in, I think, his second year running the company, and I had put him in an awkward position by committing quantities to certain markets if they would invest ahead. And we had about 6 months of bad barrels and lost an extra 5 or 6% yield. And we didn't know it till we got to bottling the barrels. And he was out of whiskey and had firm commitments, and people were screaming at him. So we thought that would solve the problem. And right before he did it, we had a chat. And we said, if we're going to do this, we need to tell our ambassadors. Because, it's the usual where you just try to slip something like that through. And we said, no, we're going to announce it. We're going to tell them what we're doing and why. And we thought everybody would be so pleased that we were upfront and told them. And this was on a Saturday of, I'm going to say Valentine's weekend. And within 2 hours, we had over 250,000 emails back. And every one of them was madder than hell. We had zero support, 250,000 irate ambassadors. And the very next Monday morning, we started printing the labels, telling the wholesalers not to sell it. We're going to take it back. And so now the ones of it that got out in the market have become serious collector items. But don't expect to see it again.
I think if I remember correctly, the even rarer collectible version was the Super Bowl bottles you guys did that year for Baltimore. Because as I recall, the ones with the purple and gold wax were all done at 42% for the Baltimore area. Those didn't get recalled.
Well, you know more about that than I do, because I was retired, and this is the first I've heard of that.
Because that was the year.
It was well, and it just got worse, because as soon as it was introduced, Jay Leno talked about us every night for a week, and it wasn't good. And I wasn't sure we were ever going to climb out of it, but our beloved ambassadors forgave us. We apologized, took the whiskey back, and it was a great lesson to all of us.
But other markets do not get that same 45%. As Chris Tesenko points out, when it was first released in Australia, it was 86 proof, 43% back in the 90s, and then dropped to 80 proof about 20 years ago. And his favorite makers is the 101 proof, along with the selects and the FAEs. But other countries do get a weaker version of makers. They get it at 40% for tax reasons, basically.
That's for tax reasons. There would what they're driving at, they want you to bottle the spirits in the local country, and we're not going to do it. So that was the only option.
And Australia is weird because it's the only country that lets you bottle below 40% anyway. I think they have a rule like 37.5 is technically whiskey there. Considering how much grief the Australians give us about our beer in America, I think we need to give them more grief about weak whiskey there.
Well, it's more than weak whiskey. It's the standards of identity, and they want to define bourbon and all. They don't make bourbon, but they want to tell us what bourbon is.
And Chris said no one's complaining because at least they still have makers available in Australia.
Well, and that would have been the option. I didn't like it at all. That was actually a decision that I made, and I was ready not to go. But we had so many people from Australia that were writing us and saying, no, we got to have some. And so we did it.
We have a great question from Chris Ratcliffe. When you go to the distillery, is there a special place that you like to go to? Something that has some sentimental meaning for you?
Yeah, there is. And it's my favorite room down there. And unfortunately, nobody gets to go much. It's the boardroom. And I've got all of the stuff that I really enjoy. We've got a family. I had a great-great-grandfather that was actually involved in getting Abraham Lincoln elected, and we've got an original Lincoln letter on the wall. We've got Frank James's pistol from the final surrender of the Civil War, which took place at our home. We have framed pictures of the distillers that really helped Dad in his the early days, giving him yeast, making samples for him, and just being a sounding board. And that was Ed Shapiro from Heaven Hill, Mr. Van Winkle, Pappy, Jerry Beam, Jim Beam's only son, and Hap Motlow, who was Jack Daniels' great nephew, Lem Motlow's son. And I remember them all. They were wonderful to help out the way they did. So we actually have framed pictures of competition in our boardroom. I don't know that you'll find that anywhere else in the world. But I love going in there and thinking about the great times I had as a small boy with these. And of course, I've got a framed picture of Harlan Sanders. I was one of his 3 first employees, and drove him around really before he got started. And what else is down? Oh, just letters from President Reagan. We provided him whiskey when he was in town for the Mondale debates, the re-election, when he did such a horrible debate. And I was convinced it's because he drank that bottle of whiskey I gave him. And later to find out that wasn't the case. They had overcoached him. So, I mean, just a lot of stuff like that. Wonderful pictures of the guys that used to live on Whiskey Row. John Shawnee that owned Early Times, Colonel Beam, and Mr. McKenna, who was our family doctor, also owned the distillery, the H. McKenna Distillery. And, just a lot of mementos.
Henry McKenna was your family doctor?
Yeah, well, Henry McKenna III.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking, okay, because the original Henry McKenna had to be the third because the first was long before your time.
Oh, my God. He was before my grandfather's time. Yeah, he was back during the Civil War.
When you drive down Whiskey Row in Bardstown, where you grew up, what do you think today? When I drive down through there, you drive past the big houses, and then you hit the railroad tracks, and you start hitting the fast food restaurants and the strip malls and stuff like that. And what do you think of driving down Whiskey Row in Bardstown and what Bardstown has become?
I think Bardstown's done a pretty good job of preserving its past. We had a lapse period in the 60s where some houses were torn down, like our house, which was next door to the Beams, and a few historic buildings. One of them was actually up where that strip mall that you're talking about now. It was a wonderful old Georgian house, but people couldn't afford to keep the places up. That's the reason Dad moved out. I mean, it was only about, I don't know, it's about 8,000 square feet, but it's 16-foot ceilings upstairs and downstairs. And the windows rattled and all, and it was spooky. And so we gave up on it in the late 40s. And then it was torn down, unfortunately.
You mentioned spooky. Are there any ghost stories around the distillery that we haven't heard until now?
No, I don't think so. I've not heard them, but they don't tell me everything.
You never had any experiences like that, did you?
Most of my experiences that were troubling had to do with floods. Of course, all the distilleries are on water, and if you're on water, you're going to get flooded. And of course, when this place was when Makers was built, it was in 1804, and they didn't use the best engineering techniques to build a thing. They just set it right down next to the creek, and we were constantly lifting motors out of the water and stuff. It's a wonder we all didn't get electrocuted. Did I see a comment about the Civil War not being so long ago?
Yeah, Bill Ricker said it wasn't that many generations back. His father knew his great-grandmother, daughter of a Civil War veteran who died slowly and quite old of the TB brought home by many from the war.
Yeah. Well, Colonel Beam, who was my godfather, was actually born during the Civil War. And I had a great aunt that was at the final surrender when the Quantrill's guerrillas surrendered in our front yard. She was 6 years old. And she's the one that ended up with Frank James' revolver, which she gave to me before she died. So you're right. I'm just really one generation removed from it myself.
How did you guys ever manage to get the distillery in Loretto up around the Sisters of Loretto at the convent?
Well, up until about the 80s, the convent and the distillery were about the only two active things going on in Marion County. Marion County now has 33 manufacturing plants. But I think historically, the sisters were there first, and they got the best land, and we need that land for grain. And so we've partnered with them from the beginning in that regard, which meant that I made a few trips a year to the mother house with cases of whiskey. I won't say any more.
Yeah, I think probably that's best left unsaid.
Oh, they're wonderful people. Unfortunately, they haven't replenished their own, and oh gosh, they're all in their 80s and 90s, and all in the hospital there at the convent.
Is there a project, and Chris Ratcliffe asks this, is there a project that you would have liked to have done at Makers but never got the chance?
Yeah. And it's probably better. Rob and I both would really like to have a first-class inn at the distillery. And I'm not sure we're ever going to get it built. I'm reasonably sure it's not going to get built while I'm outside of a nursing home. But it's just one obstacle after another, from infrastructure to cost. And really not so much would it be viable. It would have to be very expensive. And we're having a hard time rationalizing the compatibilities of the entertainment side of our business, which is the hospitality piece, with trying to run a 5-star hotel or inn. And it may happen eventually, but I wanted it to happen when Rob did about 10 years ago.
You'd have to get better internet service out there too. Better cell phone service.
Well, it's not bad. We have special service for those of us that have company cards. Yeah.
All I know is every time I go out to that distillery, and I'm just holding the phone up, hoping to find a signal somewhere because it's so far out in the countryside. And
we got that fixed about 3 years ago. Really.
Okay.
They built a tower at our warehouse complex up in the middle of Loretto, and it solved all the problems.
Okay. Speaking of those warehouses, you guys have got some of the biggest damn warehouses I've ever seen for whiskey with these 50,000 barrel monstrosities. Did you ever think you'd see warehouses that big when you were growing up?
Now, the limit when I was growing up, or the limit from a music standpoint, there the contractor was 20,000 barrels. And all of a sudden they jumped to 50 about when the boom started, about 12, 13 years ago. And now, that's kind of the size of all of them coming up now.
I'm looking at these warehouses at 50,000 barrels, and back when they had the one at Barton that collapsed a few years ago, did some calculations and found out that the weight of one of those 20,000 barrel warehouses is the weight of a 747 fully loaded at takeoff. And I'm thinking 50,000, we're talking 2.5 747s here.
Well, they're only one row higher, and the rest of it's the footprint. And they're much better engineered. And we also, of course, the reason that warehouse collapsed wasn't the weight. It was the powder post beetles got into the structure and weakened the ability of the wood to hold anything up. And so as a result of that, you do learn. And we've all had serious inspections of our rack houses and made the adjustments necessary.
I want you to tell me what it smells like when you walk into one of those rack houses after it's been sitting all night and you open the door up in the morning and you get to walk in. What's it smell like to you?
Well, it depends on when it is. It smells best in the summer. And it smells better at our place because we only have the mature whiskeys on the bottom floors, because all the new whiskey starts on top, and the aroma of the whiskey is much, much better as it gets older. And so the lower three floors are all maturing whiskeys, 4, 5, and 6 years old. So in the summer, when it's hot and humid outside, to walk in one of those warehouses, it's just magic.
Last question.
It would be a good place to have a party and spend a night.
That it would. Always wanted to camp out in a warehouse overnight. That would be fun.
Oh, yeah.
Last question. What's your legacy going to be 50 years from now when they write the history of Maker's Mark, the next generation? What are they going to say about you?
Oh, I don't know. Probably if I did anything, it was led the charge on the rebirth of bourbon. Mom and Dad did the heavy work as far as creating a bourbon that had the potential to be discovered in the market. And I spent about 80 hours a week, 50 years, not only taking it to the market, but taking it successfully. And along the way, in engaging the interest of other distillers that they could do the same thing. And as a result, we've got a lot of great whiskey in Kentucky now.
I can't put it any better than Brian Cox just did. You helped create the rebirth of bourbon that we have today. Bill Samuels, Jr., thank you for joining us tonight. Sláinte, my friends, continued good health, and keep kicking, and don't slow down anytime soon, okay?
Okay. Thanks, pal. Thanks to everybody.
That's our Happy Hour live webcast from Friday night, February 11th, with Bill Samuels, Jr., the Chairman Emeritus of Maker's Mark. This week, we'll talk with a couple of pioneers of the craft distilling movement, Lance Winters and Dave Smith of St. George Spirits in Alameda, California. The distillery is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year and produces American single malts along with the Breaking and Entering American whiskey, just to name a few. That's at 5 p.m. New York time Friday on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel, our Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. If you have comments about this webcast or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers all over the world, you can always find us on social media. Look for us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WhiskyCast, or just email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. WhiskyCast is brought to you by Dewar's and Redbreast, Our presenting sponsors, along with the segment sponsors on the podcast each week, Scarabus, Writer's Tears, Catoctin Creek, the Delmore, Mortlock, and Sagamore Spirit. WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2022, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.